Every alpha at the ball ignored the silent maid, except the one who ruled the kingdom. The tray in Alira's hands shook as a hand gripped her wrist from behind and pulled her out of the crowded ballroom into the shadow of a stone pillar. "Careful," a voice hissed. "You almost poured wine on Lady Priscilla's gown. Do you want to lose your position tonight?" Alira steadied the tray and looked up to see Colin, the head steward, glaring at her with a mixture of worry and irritation. Around them, the ballroom glittered with candlelight and laughter. Hundreds of alphas and omegas, dressed in silk and gold, all gathered for the king's grand ball. Alira had been told to stay near the walls, to move quickly, to be seen by no one. She had done this 100 times before in smaller houses, but never in a palace this large. Never with so many eyes, and so much danger hidden behind polite smiles. "I am sorry," she whispered. The floor was slippery near the fountain. Colin exhaled sharply and straightened her collar with quick, practiced movements. "Just breathe. Keep your eyes down. Serve, and disappear. That is all you need to do tonight." She nodded, though her heart still pounded from the near accident. Spilling wine on a noblewoman like Priscilla could have meant dismissal, or worse, a public scolding in front of the entire court. Alira had learned long ago that servants who drew attention rarely kept their place for long. Invisibility was not just a habit for her, it was survival. She stepped back into the golden light of the ballroom, tray balanced perfectly now, weaving between groups of alphas who barely noticed her passing. Their voices rose and fell around her like waves, boastful laughter, calculated compliments, the constant hum of ambition. Every alpha in that room had come for one reason. The king was choosing a mate tonight, or at least beginning the process of choosing one, and every family with an unmarried alpha or omega wanted their chance to be noticed. Alira had heard the rumors in the kitchens for weeks. King Alden, ruler of the kingdom since his father's passing 3 years ago, had finally agreed to hold a ball where potential mates could be presented to him. He was said to be fair but distant, generous but guarded, a king who worked long hours and rarely smiled. The older maids whispered that he had never truly recovered from losing his mother when he was young, and that he trusted almost no one within these walls. None of that concerned Alira. She was not here to be noticed. She was here to fill cups, carry trays, and vanish into the corners of the room, until the night ended, and she could return to her small quarters near the kitchens. As she moved past a cluster of alphas discussing trade routes, one of them reached out lazily and took a glass from her tray, without so much as glancing at her face. Another brushed past her shoulder as though she were a piece of furniture. This was normal. She was used to being looked through, rather than looked at. There was a strange comfort in it, even if it also ached somewhere she rarely allowed herself to feel. She reached the far end of the ballroom, near the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, and paused for a moment to catch her breath. The night air slipped in through a gap in the glass, cool against her flushed skin. From here she could see the entire room, the glittering chandeliers, the polished marble floor reflecting 1,000 candle flames, and at the head of the hall, raised on a platform, the throne where King Alden sat. She had never seen him up close before tonight. From this distance, he looked exactly as the rumors described. Tall, composed, dressed in deep blue and silver, his expression unreadable, as a line of hopeful omegas and alphas were presented to him one by one. He nodded politely to each, exchanged a few words, and let them pass. There was no warmth in his eyes, only the practiced patience of a man performing a duty he did not enjoy. Alira found herself watching him a moment too long, before catching herself and looking away. It was not her place to stare at the king. She lifted her tray again, and turned to make her way back toward the kitchens for a refill, but as she turned, she collided directly with someone stepping out from behind the pillar. The tray tipped. 2 glasses of wine crashed to the floor, shattering and splashing across the polished marble. Alira gasped and dropped to her knees immediately, scrambling to gather the broken glass before anyone noticed, her hands trembling as sharp edges nicked her fingers. "Wait, let me help you." The voice was calm, low, and utterly unfamiliar in tone, not commanding like the nobles around her, but genuinely concerned. She glanced up, and her breath caught in her throat. The man kneeling across from her, gathering broken glass with careful hands, was not a servant. His clothes were too fine, deep blue trimmed with silver thread, the fabric catching the candlelight in a way that made her stomach twist with sudden dread. "Your Majesty," she breathed. and immediately dropped her eyes, pressing her forehead nearly to the floor. "Forgive me. I did not see you. I will clean this at once, please. Do not trouble yourself." "Stop," he said, and though his voice was quiet, there was an authority in it that made her freeze. "You are bleeding." She looked down at her hand, surprised to see a thin line of red on her palm from the glass. She had not even felt it. "It is nothing," she said quickly, tucking her hand against her apron. King Alden did not move away. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze unlike anything she had experienced from any alpha in that ballroom. It did not slide past her the way the others had. It did not dismiss her as though she were part of the furniture. He looked at her the way one might look at something unexpected, something that did not fit the pattern of the evening. "What is your name?" he asked. Illyra's mind went blank with panic. No alpha at a royal ball had ever asked a maid her name, let alone the king himself. She was certain this was some kind of test, or worse, a prelude to punishment for the spilled wine. "Illyra, your majesty," she managed. "I work in the kitchens. I am truly sorry for the mess." "The mess does not matter," he said simply. He rose to his feet in one smooth motion and extended a hand toward her, an offer to help her stand. She stared at it, as though it might burn her. "I could not, your majesty," she whispered. "It would not be proper." Something flickered across his face, not anger, but a strange, tired amusement, as though he had heard that word, proper, far too many times tonight, and found it exhausting. "Proper," he repeated softly. "Very well." He withdrew his hand, but he did not leave. Instead, he crouched again beside her, and continued gathering the broken glass himself, piece by piece, ignoring the way several nearby guests had begun to notice the king of the realm, kneeling on the floor beside a maid. "You truly do not need to do that," Illyra said, her voice tight with nervousness. "Someone will see." "Let them see," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it, quiet but unshaken, that told her this was a man who rarely cared what others thought, despite the crown he wore. Whispers had already begun to ripple outward from their corner of the ballroom, spreading like a current through water. Illyra could feel dozens of eyes turning in their direction, though she kept her own gaze fixed on the shards of glass between her fingers, too afraid to look up and confirm what she already knew. Nobles did not kneel beside maids. Kings did not clean up spilled wine. Every unspoken rule of the court was being broken in this small, glittering corner of the hall, and she was the reason. "Your Majesty," came a sharp voice, and Illyra recognized it instantly as Colin's, tight with barely restrained panic. He appeared at the edge of their circle, bowing low, his face pale. "Forgive the intrusion. I will have this cleaned immediately," and the girl reprimanded for her carelessness. "There is no need for a reprimand," King Alden said, standing once more and brushing a small shard of glass from his fingers, with the ease of a man who had faced far greater troubles than a broken glass. "It was an accident. Accidents happen even at royal balls, Colin." Colin blinked, clearly surprised the king knew his name, and bowed even lower. "Of course, your majesty, as you wish." The king glanced once more at Illyra, who remained frozen in place, unsure whether to stand, bow, or simply disappear into the floor if such a thing were possible. "Illyra," he said, testing the name again as though committing it to memory. "Thank you for your service tonight." Before she could respond, he turned and walked back toward the center of the ballroom, where a line of anxious alphas and omegas waited to be presented to him, all of whom had clearly witnessed the strange scene by the window, and were now exchanging confused, calculating glances. Illyra remained kneeling for a moment longer, her heart hammering, her cut palm forgotten. Colin knelt beside her, and began helping gather the remaining glass, his movements quick and clipped with nervous energy. "What was that?" he whispered urgently. "Do you know what you just did?" "The king himself, kneeling beside you, in front of half the court?" "I did not ask for that," Illyra said, her voice barely audible. "I do not know why he stopped." "It does not matter why," Colin said, glancing over his shoulder toward the throne, where King Alden had resumed his seat, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. "What matters is that people saw it, and people will talk." Illyra followed his gaze toward the platform. The king sat exactly as he had before, composed, distant, listening politely to the next hopeful pair presented before him. From this distance, it was almost possible to believe the last few minutes had not happened at all, that she had imagined the whole strange encounter. But her hand still stung faintly where the glass had cut her, and the memory of his voice, steady and unbothered by the rules that governed everyone else in that room, remained sharp and real in her mind. She gathered the last of the broken glass onto her tray and rose to her feet, aware now of eyes following her, as she made her way back toward the kitchens. Whispers trailed behind her like smoke, faint but unmistakable. A few nobles exchanged glances as she passed, their expressions unreadable, somewhere between curiosity and disdain. Lady Priscilla, the woman she had nearly spilled wine on earlier, watched her cross the room with narrowed eyes and a small, tight smile that did not reach her face, the kind of smile that promised trouble rather than kindness. By the time Elira reached the kitchen doors, her hands were trembling again, though not from fear of punishment this time. Something had shifted tonight, something she did not yet understand, and she was certain, with a growing unease settling in her chest, that this was only the beginning. The kitchen was a world away from the glittering ballroom, filled with steam, clattering pots, and the constant shouted orders of the head cook. Elira slipped inside and pressed her back against the cool stone wall, finally allowing herself to breathe. Her palm throbbed faintly, and she wrapped it in a strip of cloth from a nearby shelf, her fingers still unsteady. "There you are," said Margaret, one of the older kitchen maids, bustling past with a tray of pastries. She paused when she saw Elira's face. "You look like you have seen a ghost, girl. What happened out there?" "Nothing," Elira said quickly. Too quickly. "I broke some glasses, that is all." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but the kitchen was too busy for questions to linger. She hurried off toward the serving doors, leaving Elira alone for a brief moment with her thoughts. She thought of the king's hand extended toward her, an offer she had refused out of fear rather than pride. She thought of his voice, calm, even as the entire ballroom watched him kneel beside a maid to clean up spilled wine. Alphas did not behave that way, not the ones she had encountered in her life, not the ones who barked orders, or looked through servants as though they did not exist. There had been something different in his eyes, something that unsettled her far more than any scolding from Colin ever could. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings were unpredictable. Perhaps he had simply been bored of the endless procession of hopeful nobles, and found a moment's distraction in an ordinary accident. By morning, she was certain, he would not remember her name at all. But even as she carried that thought back into the noise and heat of the kitchen, some quiet part of her did not quite believe it. The ball continued long into the night, and Elira returned to her duties, refilling trays, delivering platters, keeping her eyes low as she had been taught. She did not see the king again, not directly, though twice she caught him glancing toward the far side of the room where she stood, his expression difficult to read from such a distance. Each time, she quickly looked away, her cheeks warming despite herself. Lady Priscilla, she noticed, seemed to be watching her as well, though with far less warmth in her gaze. The noblewoman drifted through the crowd with practiced grace, laughing at the right moments, complimenting the right people, but her eyes returned again and again to the corner near the windows where the strange scene had unfolded earlier. Elira did not know Priscilla personally, only by reputation, the daughter of a powerful house, widely expected by the court to be among the king's top considerations for a mate. She was beautiful, in the sharp, deliberate way of someone who had spent a lifetime being told she was destined for greatness, and Elira suspected, without knowing quite why, that a woman like that would not take kindly to any disruption of her plans. As the night wore on and the crowd began to thin, Elira found herself near the servants' entrance, waiting for a fresh tray of refreshments to be prepared. She leaned against the cool stone wall, grateful for a brief moment of stillness, when she became aware of someone standing nearby. She turned and found Lady Priscilla only a few steps away, her golden gown catching the candlelight, her expression pleasant on the surface, but carrying an unmistakable edge beneath it. "You are the maid from earlier," Priscilla said, her voice smooth and light, though her eyes were anything but warm. "The one who spilled wine, and captured the king's attention in the same evening. How resourceful." Elira lowered her gaze immediately, bowing her head. "It was an accident, my lady. I meant no disrespect." "Of course you did not," Priscilla said, stepping closer, close enough that Elira could smell the sharp sweetness of her perfume. "Accidents happen," But you should know, girl, that kindness from a king means very little. He is polite to dogs and beggars in the street as well. It does not make them worthy of a crown." The words landed exactly as they were meant to, quiet and precise, a blade wrapped in silk. Elira said nothing, unsure of any response that would not make things worse. "I only offer this as a kindness," Priscilla continued, her smile never wavering. "Do not mistake a moment's distraction for anything more. It would be a shame for a girl like you to forget her place and suffer for it later." She let the words hang in the air for a moment before turning and gliding back toward the ballroom, leaving Elira standing alone in the shadows, her heart pounding with a feeling she could not quite name. She told herself Priscilla's warning did not matter. She had no intention of forgetting her place. She had never wanted attention, had never sought anything beyond the quiet, invisible life she had built for herself within these palace walls. Whatever strange moment had passed between herself and the king tonight, she was certain it would fade by morning, forgotten among the hundreds of other faces he had greeted throughout the evening. And yet, as she carried the fresh tray back into the golden light of the ballroom, she could not stop the small, persistent thought that curled quietly at the edge of her mind, refusing to be dismissed no matter how firmly she tried to push it away. The ball ended well past midnight. Elira helped clear the last of the trays, her feet aching, her mind heavy with exhaustion and the strange weight of everything that had happened. As the final guests departed and the great doors of the ballroom were closed for the night, she allowed herself one last glance toward the throne, now empty, the candles around it burning low. She did not know it yet, but the quiet, invisible life she had built for herself had already begun to change, set into motion by a single accident, a single kneeling king, and a single name spoken aloud in a room full of people who had never bothered to ask it before. Behind her, unseen in the shadows of a side corridor, Lady Priscilla watched the empty ballroom with narrowed eyes, already turning over plans in her mind. Whatever had happened tonight, she intended to make certain it went no further. Morning came too soon, and Elira was already awake when the first bell rang through the servants' quarters. She had barely slept, her mind circling endlessly back to the ballroom, to the king's steady voice, to Priscilla's quiet threat. She rose from her narrow bed, splashed cold water on her face, and dressed quickly in her gray uniform, telling herself firmly that today would be no different from any other day. She was wrong within the first hour. Elira. Margaret caught her by the arm as she crossed the kitchen with a basket of bread, her face tight with something between excitement and worry. "There is talk, all through the palace, about last night." "What talk?" Elira asked, though a cold weight had already settled in her stomach. "About the king," Margaret said, lowering her voice, even though the kitchen was loud with clattering pans and shouted orders, kneeling beside a maid, cleaning up glass with his own hands. "Half the nobles who saw it have not stopped talking since they arrived this morning for the breakfast reception. They say he asked your name." "It was nothing," Elira said, though the words felt thinner each time she repeated them. "An accident. He was only being polite." Margaret gave her a long look, the kind that suggested she did not believe a word of it. But before she could press further, the head cook bellowed for more bread to be carried to the dining hall, and the moment passed in a rush of steam and shouted instructions. Elira spent the morning trying to disappear into her work, scrubbing pots, carrying linens, avoiding the eyes of the other servants, who now seemed to glance her way more often than usual. She told herself it would pass. Court gossip burned bright and fast, and by tomorrow there would be some new scandal to occupy the nobility's attention. She only needed to survive today. That plan lasted until midday, when Colin found her in the linen room, his face pale, and his hands wringing together in obvious distress. "You are being summoned," he said without preamble. Elira's stomach dropped. "Summoned? By whom?" "The king," Colin said, and the words seemed to cost him great effort to say aloud. "He has requested your presence in the East receiving room." Now. For a moment, Elira could not move. Every instinct told her this was a mistake, that some terrible misunderstanding was about to unfold, that she was about to be blamed for something, punished for daring to exist in the same corner of a ballroom as the king of the realm. "Why would he want to see me?" she whispered. "I do not know," Colin said, though his tone suggested he had his own fears about the answer. "But you cannot refuse a summons from the king, Elira. Whatever this is, you must go." He walked her through the palace corridors himself, his pace quick and anxious, glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting disaster to appear behind them at any moment. Alira followed in silence, her heart pounding harder with every step, every polished hallway bringing her closer to a meeting she could not begin to predict. The palace by daylight looked entirely different from the ballroom she had known the night before, quieter, grander, the walls lined with portraits of kings and queens long since passed, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she walked beneath them. They reached a set of tall wooden doors, and Colin stopped, straightening his jacket nervously before knocking twice. A guard opened the door from within and gestured for Alira to enter alone. Colin gave her one last worried glance before she stepped through the threshold, and the door closed behind her with a soft, final click. The east receiving room was smaller than the ballroom, warmer somehow, with tall windows letting in streams of afternoon light and a fireplace crackling gently, despite the mild weather outside. King Alden stood near the window, his back to the door, dressed more simply today, in dark riding clothes, rather than the formal attire of the previous night. He turned when he heard her enter, and Alira immediately dropped into a low bow, her eyes fixed on the polished floor. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice barely steady. "You summoned me." "I did." He studied her for a long moment, before gesturing toward a chair near the fireplace. "Please, sit." Alira remained frozen, uncertain she had heard correctly. "I could not, Your Majesty. It would not be my place." A faint, tired smile crossed his face, the same expression she had glimpsed briefly the night before. "You said that last night as well. I begin to think it is your favorite phrase." "It is simply true," she said quietly. "Humor me then," he said, and though his tone remained gentle, there was a note in it that told her this was not truly a request. She hesitated only a moment longer, before lowering herself carefully onto the edge of the offered chair, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. King Alden did not sit across from her as she expected. Instead, he remained standing near the fireplace, his gaze distant, as though gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I imagine you are wondering why I called for you," he said finally. "I confess I am, Your Majesty. Last night, in that entire ballroom, filled with alphas, competing for my attention, offering me every practiced compliment and rehearsed introduction imaginable, you were the only person who looked at me as though I were simply a man, and not a crown." He turned to face her fully now. "You did not want anything from me. You were afraid, yes, but not of losing an opportunity. You were afraid of drawing attention at all." Alira did not know how to respond. She had not expected honesty, not from a king, not directed at a maid who had spilled wine on his floor. "I did not mean to draw any attention, Your Majesty. I only wished to do my work quietly." "I know," he said. "That is precisely what I found so unusual." He walked slowly toward the window again, looking out over the palace gardens below. "Every person who has been presented to me these past weeks wants something. A title, an alliance, security for their family. I do not fault them for it. That is simply how this world works. But it grows tiring, being seen only as a means to an end." "I cannot imagine what that must be like," Alira said softly, and meant it. Her own struggles felt small in comparison to the weight he must carry, though she understood, in a smaller way, the exhaustion of being seen for only one purpose, rather than as a whole person. He turned back toward her, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, though something kept her still. "Tell me about yourself, Alira. Where are you from?" The question caught her off guard, and old, practiced instincts rose immediately to guard her tongue. "There is little to tell, Your Majesty. I have worked in kitchens and households since I was young. I came to the palace 2 years ago." "And before that?" "It does not matter," she said, perhaps too quickly, and saw a flicker of curiosity cross his expression at her evasion. "Very well," he said, choosing not to press further, though she sensed the question had not been forgotten, merely set aside. "I will not force you to speak of things you wish to keep private." Relief loosened some of the tension in her shoulders, though a new unease replaced it almost immediately. Why would the king care about her past at all? What could possibly interest him in the quiet, unremarkable history of a palace maid? "May I ask you something, Your Majesty?" she said, before she could stop herself. He raised an eyebrow, seeming almost pleased by the question. "You may. Why does any of this matter to you?" I am only a maid. There are countless omegas and alphas of noble birth, eager for your attention. I do not understand why you would spend even a moment considering someone like me." For a long moment he did not answer, his gaze thoughtful, almost searching, as though weighing how honest to be with her. "Perhaps," he said finally, "because you are the only person in this palace who has never once tried to convince me of your worth. Everyone else performs. You simply exist, without pretense. I find that rare, and I find that I trust it." The words settled heavily in the quiet room, and Alira did not know how to respond to them. Trust was not something offered lightly, especially not from a king to a maid he had known for less than a full day. She wanted to believe him, and that frightened her more than any threat Priscilla could have whispered the night before. A soft knock interrupted the moment, and a guard entered, bowing quickly. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption. Lord Edmund requests an urgent audience regarding the eastern border reports." King Alden sighed, the brief warmth in his expression giving way to the familiar weight of duty. "I will be there shortly." The guard bowed again and withdrew, leaving them alone once more, though the moment had clearly shifted. "I must attend to this," the king said, turning back to Alira. "But I would like to speak with you again, if you are willing." Alira rose from the chair, uncertain how to answer such a request from a king, uncertain whether refusal was even possible. "As you wish, Your Majesty." He studied her a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before nodding once and moving toward the door. "Thank you, Alira. For today, and for last night." She remained standing near the fireplace long after he had gone, her thoughts a tangled knot of confusion and quiet, unfamiliar warmth. No alpha had ever spoken to her the way he had, without demand, without dismissal, simply curious, simply present. She did not know what to make of it, and she was not certain she wanted to examine the feeling too closely. When she finally left the receiving room, Colin was waiting anxiously in the corridor outside, practically pouncing on her the moment she emerged. "Well, what happened? What did he want?" "He only wished to thank me for last night," Alira said, choosing her words carefully, unwilling to share the full truth of the conversation with anyone. Not yet, perhaps not ever. Colin looked unconvinced, but did not press further as they walked back toward the servants' quarters. The palace corridors seemed to hum with quiet attention as they passed, servants and guards alike glancing toward Alira with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. Word of the summons had clearly already spread, faster than she could have anticipated. By the time she returned to her duties in the kitchen, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Margaret gave her worried looks between tasks. Other maids whispered behind their hands whenever she passed. Even the head cook, usually too busy to notice anything beyond the state of his sauces, glanced her way with narrowed, calculating eyes. Alira threw herself into her work, scrubbing floors and polishing silver with fierce concentration, as though physical labor could somehow drown out the growing unease building inside her. She did not want this attention. She had never wanted it, and yet some quiet, traitorous part of her mind kept returning to the king's words, to the honesty in his voice when he said he trusted her, to the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had bloomed in her chest, despite every instinct warning her against it. That evening, as she carried a basket of laundry through the servants' courtyard, she nearly collided with a young page running urgently in the opposite direction. "Watch yourself," the boy said, then paused, recognizing her. "Oh, you are the one everyone is talking about." "I am simply a maid," Alira said, though the words felt increasingly hollow each time she spoke them. The boy shrugged, clearly uninterested in philosophical debate, and hurried off toward the main hall. Alira watched him go, then turned to continue toward the laundry rooms, only to find Lady Priscilla standing at the edge of the courtyard, watching her with the same sharp, calculating expression from the night before. "Twice in 2 days," Priscilla said, stepping closer, her voice pleasant on the surface, though the underlying edge remained unmistakable. "The king seems quite taken with his new little project." "I do not know what you mean, my lady," Alira said, lowering her eyes, though her heart hammered with renewed anxiety. "Do not insult me by pretending ignorance," Priscilla said, her smile thinning. "The entire court is speaking of nothing else. A maid summoned to a private audience, the very morning after catching the king's eye at the ball. It is almost charming, in a foolish sort of way." Alira said nothing, uncertain how to respond to the accusation buried beneath the pleasant words. "Let me offer you some honest advice," Priscilla continued, stepping closer still, close enough that Alira could see the hard glint in her pale eyes. "Kings grow bored quickly. Whatever curiosity you have sparked in him will fade, and when it does, you will still be a maid, and I will still be the daughter of one of the most powerful houses in this kingdom. Do not mistake his passing interest for anything real, and do not make the mistake of getting in my way." With that, she turned and swept back toward the palace, her golden gown trailing behind her like a warning made visible. Alira remained standing in the courtyard for a long moment, the laundry basket heavy in her arms, Priscilla's words settling over her like a cold shadow. She did not want any of this. She had never asked for the king's attention, had never sought to become the subject of court gossip, or the target of a powerful noblewoman's jealousy. And yet here she stood, caught in the middle of something far larger than herself, with no clear way to step back out of its path. That night, lying in her narrow bed, long after the palace had gone quiet, Alira stared up at the shadowed ceiling and tried to make sense of everything that had happened in the span of a single day. She thought of the king's honest, searching eyes. She thought of Priscilla's cold, precise threats. She thought of her own carefully guarded past, buried for good reason, and the growing fear that it might not stay buried much longer. Whatever this strange, unexpected attention meant, she understood with growing certainty that her quiet, invisible life within these palace walls had already changed beyond recognition, and there would be no returning to the way things had been before. 3 days passed before Alira was summoned again, and in that time, the whispers in the palace grew louder rather than quieter, no matter how she tried to stay hidden within her usual duties. She scrubbed floors before dawn, avoided the main corridors during the busiest hours, and kept her eyes fixed firmly on her work whenever nobles passed nearby. None of it mattered. The story had already taken root, and like any story passed from mouth to mouth within palace walls, it had grown far beyond the truth of what had actually happened. She overheard fragments of it everywhere. A kitchen maid claimed Alira had once served in a noble house before falling into disgrace. A guard insisted she had bewitched the king with some clever trick learned from traveling performers. One particularly imaginative rumor suggested she was secretly a spy sent by a rival kingdom to seduce her way into the royal bloodline. None of it was true, but Alira found she had no power to stop any of it, and every attempt to correct the stories only seemed to add fuel to their spread. Colin, to his credit, tried his best to shield her from the worst of it, reassigning her to quieter tasks, away from the busiest halls, warning off the more aggressive gossips among the staff. But even he could not protect her from everything, and Alira began to notice small cruelties creeping into her days that had never existed before. A basket of clean linens mysteriously soaked through with dirty water. A pot she had scrubbed clean found smeared with grease again moments before inspection. Small, deniable acts of sabotage that left her constantly on edge, uncertain who among the staff she could still trust. She said nothing of it to anyone, certain that complaining would only make things worse, would only confirm whatever suspicions the other servants already held about her supposed ambitions. She endured it quietly, the way she had endured difficulties her entire life, keeping her head down and her thoughts carefully guarded. It was during one of these tense, quiet mornings that Colin found her polishing silverware in a small side room near the kitchens, his expression once again carrying that particular blend of urgency and worry that had become distressingly familiar. "The king requests your presence again," he said, this time in the private garden, not the receiving room. Alira set down the silver polish, her hands trembling slightly. "Colin, I do not know what to do. This is only making things worse. The other staff already look at me as though I have done something terrible." Colin's expression softened, and for a moment the usual anxious edge in his voice gave way to something gentler. "I know it is difficult, but you cannot refuse him, Alira. Whatever is happening, it is beyond either of our control now." She followed him through the palace once more, past the same painted portraits, past clusters of servants who fell silent as she passed, and resumed whispering the moment she was out of earshot. By the time they reached the private garden entrance, her nerves felt stretched thin as wire. The garden itself was beautiful, quiet, secluded behind high stone walls covered in climbing ivy, filled with the soft sound of a fountain and the gentle rustle of late summer blooms. King Alden stood near the fountain, dressed simply once more. His posture relaxed in a way she had not seen during the formal ball. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression eased at the sight of her. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for her to join him near the fountain's edge. "I thought perhaps we might speak somewhere quieter this time, away from listening ears." "Your Majesty, I do not wish to cause trouble," Illyra said carefully, choosing her words with great care. "The staff already speak unkindly of me, because of the attention I have received. I fear further summons will only make matters worse." Alden's expression darkened slightly, and he studied her more closely. "Has someone been unkind to you?" "It is nothing I cannot manage," she said quickly, unwilling to name names or invite further complications into an already precarious situation. "Illyra." His voice carried a firmness she had not heard from him before, though it remained gentle rather than harsh. "If someone within this palace is treating you poorly because of my actions, I would like to know." "Please, Your Majesty," she said, lowering her eyes. "I only wish to continue my work quietly. I do not seek special treatment or protection. It would only draw more attention and more resentment." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between frustration and reluctant understanding. "Very well," he said finally. "I will not force the issue, though I confess it troubles me to know you are enduring difficulty because of my curiosity." They walked slowly along the garden path together, the king matching his pace to hers, an act of consideration she had never experienced from anyone of higher standing. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves above, casting shifting patterns of light across the stone path beneath their feet. "May I ask you something else then?" he said after a while. "Something less personal, if that would ease your mind." "Of course, Your Majesty. What do you enjoy? When you are not working, when no one requires anything of you? What brings you happiness?" The question caught her off guard, unexpected in its simplicity, and she found herself hesitating, searching for an honest answer rather than a practiced deflection. "I enjoy the early mornings," she said finally, "before the palace wakes. There is a stillness to it that I find peaceful, and I enjoy reading, when I have the chance to borrow a book from the palace library." "You can read?" he asked, and though there was no judgment in his tone, only genuine surprise, Illyra felt a familiar flicker of old caution rise within her. "Yes," she said simply, offering no further explanation. He seemed to sense the boundary in her tone and did not press for more, though his curiosity remained visible in his expression. "What do you read, when you have the chance?" "Histories, mostly," she said, relaxing slightly now that the conversation had moved to safer ground. "Stories of the old kingdoms, the wars and alliances that shaped this land. I find comfort in understanding how things came to be as they are." A small, genuine smile crossed his face, the first true smile she had seen from him. "I share that interest, though I confess my studies of history were always more obligation than pleasure, given my position. It is refreshing to hear someone speak of it with real enthusiasm." They continued walking, the conversation drifting easily between topics: history, the changing seasons, small observations about the garden around them. Illyra found herself relaxing despite every instinct urging caution, drawn in by the easy, unhurried nature of his company. He asked nothing more of her past, made no demands, offered no false compliments. He simply spoke with her as though she were an equal, a novelty so foreign to her experience that she almost did not know how to receive it. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting the garden in warm golden light, they reached a small stone bench near the far wall, and Alden gestured for her to sit. This time, she did not refuse, lowering herself onto the bench beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him despite maintaining a respectful distance. "I must confess something to you," he said, his voice quieter now, more serious. "My advisors are already pressing me to make a decision regarding a mate. There are political considerations, alliances to strengthen, expectations from noble houses who have waited years for this opportunity. It is not a simple matter of personal choice, however much I might wish it were." Illyra's chest tightened at his words, though she was not entirely certain why. "I understand, Your Majesty. Such decisions carry weight far beyond personal preference." "Yes," he said, watching her carefully. "And yet I find myself increasingly reluctant to choose someone simply because it would please my advisors, or satisfy political necessity. I have spent 3 years ruling this kingdom largely alone, surrounded by people who want something from me, and I find I have little patience left for continuing that pattern within my own household. What is it you want instead, Your Majesty? She asked softly, though some part of her feared the answer, feared what it might mean for her already precarious position within the palace. He turned to look at her fully, his gaze steady and searching. Someone who sees me, rather than the crown I wear. Someone honest, even when honesty is inconvenient. I do not yet know if such a thing is possible within my circumstances, but I find myself unwilling to settle for anything less. The words hung between them, heavy with implication, and Alira did not trust herself to respond, uncertain whether speaking would reveal too much of the confusion tightening in her own chest. She had spent her entire life avoiding attention, avoiding entanglement with anyone of power or influence, and yet here she sat, in a private garden, beside a king who spoke to her with more honesty than any alpha she had ever encountered. Before either of them could say more, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the quiet, and a guard appeared at the garden entrance, bowing quickly. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. Lord Edmund insists on an urgent matter regarding the northern trade agreements. Alden sighed, the familiar weight of duty settling back over his expression. I will attend to it shortly. He turned back to Alira as the guard withdrew, his voice softening once more. Thank you for indulging my company this afternoon. It was no burden, Your Majesty, she said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it entirely. He walked her partway back toward the servants' quarters himself, an act that drew several startled glances from passing staff and nobles alike, though he seemed entirely unconcerned by the attention it invited. At the edge of the servants' courtyard, he paused, studying her once more with that same searching expression. I would like to continue these conversations, if you are willing, he said. Not as summons, but as something freely chosen, on your part as well as mine. Alira hesitated, torn between the growing warmth she could not deny feeling in his presence, and the very real dangers such attention had already begun to create within her daily life. I fear what such attention might cost me, Your Majesty, she admitted honestly. Among the staff, and perhaps beyond them as well. I understand your fear, he said, and something in his tone suggested he understood it more deeply than she realized. I will do what I can to ease that burden, though I cannot promise it will disappear entirely. All I ask is that you allow me the chance to know you better, at whatever pace feels safe to you. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for some hint of falseness, some trace of the careless disregard she had grown to expect from those with power over her life. She found none. Very well, Your Majesty, she said finally. I am willing. A genuine warmth lit his expression at her answer, brief but unmistakable, before duty called him away once more, leaving Alira standing alone at the edge of the courtyard, her heart caught somewhere between hope and dread. She did not see the figure watching from a shadowed archway nearby, nor did she notice the quiet, calculating expression on Lady Priscilla's face as she observed the king walking a maid halfway across the palace grounds, with obvious care in his manner. Priscilla remained still long after they had parted ways, her mind already turning over new plans, more decisive measures than mere whispered warnings in a courtyard. Whatever affection was growing between the king and this quiet, unremarkable maid, Priscilla intended to end it before it could take root any deeper, whatever the cost required to do so. A week passed, and Alira found herself falling into a strange new rhythm, dividing her days between the usual demands of palace work and quiet, stolen moments with the king, always careful, always brief, but growing steadily more meaningful with each meeting. They spoke in the garden most often, sometimes in the early evening after her duties ended, sometimes during rare gaps in his own crowded schedule. He asked about her opinions on the histories she read, and she found herself, slowly and cautiously, offering more of her true thoughts than she had shared with anyone in years. She still refused to speak of her past, and he still did not press her, though she sometimes caught him studying her with quiet curiosity, as though piecing together questions he had not yet found the courage or the right moment to ask aloud. She was grateful for his patience, even as a small, persistent unease continued to grow within her, a sense that whatever she was hiding could not remain buried forever, not now that so many eyes had turned in her direction. The trouble, when it came, arrived swiftly, and without warning. Alira was returning from the linen stores late one evening, her arms full of fresh sheets for the guest quarters, when Colin intercepted her in the corridor, his face white with alarm. "You need to come with me," he said, his voice tight and urgent. "Now." "What has happened?" she asked, dread already curling in her stomach at the sight of his expression. "A brooch belonging to Lady Priscilla has gone missing," Colin said, guiding her quickly down a side corridor away from the main halls. "A valuable one, a family heirloom. She claims it was in her chambers this morning and gone by this afternoon." Alira's steps faltered. "What does that have to do with me?" Colin's expression grew even more strained. "She is telling anyone who will listen that you were seen near her chambers earlier today, delivering fresh linens. She is accusing you of theft, Alira, and half the court is already prepared to believe her." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "I did deliver linens to that wing this morning, but I never entered her private chambers. I left the linens with her personal attendant, as I always do." "I believe you," Colin said quickly, "but belief will not be enough if this reaches the King's Council. Lady Priscilla has powerful allies, and accusations against a maid, particularly one already the subject of court gossip, will not require much evidence to gain traction." Before Alira could fully process the weight of what he was saying, they turned a corner and found themselves facing two palace guards, expressions grim and unyielding. "Alira, kitchen maid," one of them said, stepping forward. "You are to come with us. Lady Priscilla has lodged a formal accusation of theft against you, and by order of the Palace Council, your quarters are to be searched immediately." "I have taken nothing," Alira said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to remain composed. "I swear it. I have never even entered Lady Priscilla's private chambers." "That is not for us to determine," the guard said, not unkindly, though his tone left no room for argument. "You will come with us now." Colin stepped forward, his own voice tight with barely restrained panic. "Surely this can wait until the king has been informed. This is a serious accusation, and the girl deserves the chance to explain herself properly before any search takes place." "Our orders come directly from the Palace Council," the second guard replied. "The king has been informed and is currently occupied with matters regarding the northern border. The council has authorized the search to proceed without delay." Alira felt the world narrowing around her, the corridor walls seeming to close in as the guards flanked her on either side. She thought of her small, sparse quarters, the few belongings she owned, the single item hidden carefully at the bottom of her trunk that she had kept secret from everyone within these palace walls for 2 long years. If that were discovered during this search, no explanation about a missing brooch would matter at all. They walked her through the palace, past clusters of curious onlookers, who paused their conversations to watch the small procession pass, whispers rising in their wake like startled birds taking flight. By the time they reached the servants' quarters, a small crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by the spreading news of scandal and accusation. Alira stood in the doorway of her small room, watching helplessly as the guards began methodically searching through her few possessions, her narrow bed, her small chest of clothing, the shelf where she kept the handful of borrowed books from the palace library. Her heart pounded with each passing moment, dread building toward the inevitable discovery she knew was coming. One of the guards knelt before her trunk and lifted the false bottom she had constructed years ago, a simple but effective hiding place she had believed secure from casual inspection. He withdrew a small, carefully wrapped bundle of cloth and unfolded it slowly, revealing a delicate silver pendant, old and finely crafted, bearing a crest she had spent years trying to forget. The guard's expression shifted immediately from routine duty to sharp suspicion. "What is this?" "It belonged to my mother," Alira said quietly, her voice barely steady, aware of the small crowd of onlookers pressing closer to witness the unfolding scene. "It has nothing to do with the missing brooch." The guard studied the pendant closely, turning it over in his hands, and Alira watched with growing horror as recognition slowly dawned across his features. "This crest," he said slowly, "I have seen it before, in the old records. This belongs to a noble house, one that fell from favor and was exiled from the kingdom nearly 2 decades ago." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, curiosity sharpening into something closer to shock. Alira closed her eyes briefly, feeling the careful walls she had built around her past crumbling in real time, exposed before an audience of strangers in the worst possible circumstances. "I am only a maid," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Whatever that crest once meant, it has no bearing on who I am now." "That will be for the council to determine," the guard said, wrapping the pendant carefully and placing it with the small collection of evidence gathered from her search. Though no missing brooch had been found among her belongings, the discovery of the pendant had clearly shifted the nature of the investigation entirely. "You will come with us to the council chambers," the guard continued. "There are questions that require answers beyond a simple theft accusation." Illyra felt Colin's hand grip her shoulder briefly, a small gesture of support amid the chaos unfolding around her. "I will inform the king immediately," he whispered, before the guards led her away, through corridors now thick with whispered speculation, past faces she recognized and faces she did not, all watching with the same hungry curiosity that had followed her since the night of the ball. The council chambers were formal and imposing, a long table surrounded by stern-faced advisors who regarded her with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to open suspicion as she was brought before them. Lady Priscilla sat near the head of the table, her expression carefully arranged into one of wounded innocence, though Illyra did not miss the small, satisfied glint hidden beneath the surface. "This is the maid accused of theft," announced Lord Edmund, an older advisor with sharp eyes and a stern demeanor, gesturing for Illyra to stand before the assembled council. "Though it seems this matter has grown considerably more complicated than a missing brooch." The pendant was placed on the table before them, and several council members leaned forward to examine it, murmuring among themselves as they recognized the crest engraved upon its surface. "Explain yourself," Lord Edmund said, fixing Illyra with a hard stare. "How does a kitchen maid come to possess an item belonging to a disgraced noble house?" Illyra stood as straight as she could manage, though her legs trembled beneath her plain gray dress. "It belonged to my mother," she said, choosing her words with careful precision. "I do not know the full history behind it. I have kept it only as a memory of her, nothing more." "And your mother's connection to this house?" Lord Edmund pressed. "Was she a member of this family, or merely a servant who acquired the item through less honest means?" The accusation stung, though Illyra kept her expression carefully neutral. "I was very young when my mother passed. I know little of her history beyond what few things she left behind." Lady Priscilla leaned forward slightly, her voice smooth and deliberately casual. "It seems rather convenient, does it not, that a maid harboring hidden noble connections happens to catch the king's personal attention so soon after arriving at this palace. One might almost suspect deliberate design, rather than mere accident." Murmurs rose among the council members at her insinuation, and Illyra felt the ground shifting further beneath her, the accusation of theft now overshadowed entirely by darker implications of manipulation and hidden ambition. "I have done nothing but perform my duties honestly since arriving here," Illyra said, struggling to keep her voice steady despite the mounting pressure bearing down on her. "Whatever history lies behind that pendant, I have never sought to use it for any advantage. I did not even know its full significance until this very moment." Before Lord Edmund could respond, the heavy chamber doors swung open, and King Alden strode into the room, his expression thunderous, his usual composed bearing replaced by barely restrained anger. The council members rose immediately, bowing in unison, though Illyra remained frozen in place, uncertain what his arrival might mean for her already precarious situation. "I was told this council convened to investigate a theft," he said, his voice cutting sharply through the tense silence of the chamber. "I was not informed it had transformed into an interrogation of a member of my household staff regarding matters entirely unrelated to the original accusation." "Your Majesty," Lord Edmund began carefully, "new evidence has come to light that raises serious questions regarding this maid's true identity and possible hidden motives." Alden's gaze swept across the table, landing briefly on the silver pendant before returning to Illyra, whose composure was finally beginning to crack beneath the weight of the room's collective scrutiny. "And has any evidence actually connected her to the missing brooch that prompted this investigation in the first place?" A heavy silence followed his question, broken finally by Lady Priscilla's careful, measured voice. "Though her hidden connections certainly raise concerns worth examining further. Concerns that apparently justify searching a servant's private quarters without my knowledge or consent," Alden said, his tone sharp enough to make several council members visibly flinch. "I will not tolerate accusations built on rumor and insinuation, rather than actual evidence. If Lady Priscilla's brooch has genuinely gone missing, I expect a proper investigation, conducted with appropriate discretion, not a public spectacle designed to humiliate a member of my staff. Your Majesty, Lord Edmund said carefully, the discovery of the pendant does raise legitimate questions regarding her background, questions that may bear relevance to matters of palace security. Alden's jaw tightened, though when he spoke again, his voice had regained some measure of its usual composure. Then those questions will be addressed properly, through appropriate channels, not through public accusation before this entire council. Alira will return to her quarters, and this matter will be revisited once actual evidence, rather than speculation, has been gathered. He turned to Alira, his expression softening slightly, though the tension in his shoulders remained visible. You are dismissed for now. I will speak with you further once this chaos has settled. Alira bowed quickly, grateful for the reprieve, even as her mind raced with unanswered questions and mounting dread. As she turned to leave the chamber, she caught Lady Priscilla's gaze one final time, and the cold, calculating satisfaction, hidden behind the noblewoman's carefully composed expression, told her clearly that this confrontation, however it had concluded for the moment, was far from over. She walked back through the palace corridors in a daze, Colin appearing at her side partway through the journey, his relief at seeing her released evident, despite the many questions, still clearly burning behind his eyes. What happened in there? He asked quietly as they walked. I do not fully understand it myself, Alira admitted, her voice hollow with exhaustion and lingering fear. But I fear this is only the beginning of far greater trouble. Behind them, unseen, the whispers of the gathered court continued to spread through the palace like wildfire, carrying with them a name, a crest, and a mystery that Alira had spent her entire life trying desperately to keep buried. Alira did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the small space now feeling colder and more exposed than it ever had before, knowing that guards had walked through it, that her private trunk had been opened, that the one secret she had guarded so carefully for 2 years now sat locked away somewhere within the palace council's possession. She held her knees to her chest and stared at the darkened wall, memories she had spent years pushing away rising unbidden to the surface. She remembered fragments of her early childhood, though much of it remained blurred and uncertain, the way distant memories often do. A large house with tall windows. A woman with kind eyes and dark hair who sang softly while braiding ribbons through her hair. Shouting in the night, once, followed by hurried packing and a long, frightened journey through unfamiliar roads. After that, only fragments remained. A small village where she and her mother lived quietly, under a different name. Years of careful, whispered warnings, never to speak of where they had come from. Her mother's illness, sudden and unforgiving, when Alira was barely 12 years old. And then, alone, she had learned quickly that survival meant silence, meant blending into whatever household would take her in, meant never asking questions, and never answering them either. The pendant had been the only thing she kept from that life, tucked away and hidden. A small piece of a mother she barely remembered clearly enough to miss properly. She had never fully understood its significance, only that her mother had guarded it as fiercely as she guarded their true names, and that instinct alone had been enough to convince Alira to protect it just as carefully. Now it sat in the possession of the palace council, and whatever careful anonymity she had built for herself over the past 2 years had already begun to unravel in ways she could not control. Morning brought no relief. She was summoned again, not to the garden this time, but to a private study she had never entered before, smaller and more personal than the formal receiving room, filled with books and worn, comfortable furniture that suggested this was a space King Alden used for himself rather than official business. He was waiting when she arrived, standing near a window, the silver pendant resting on the desk before him. He turned when she entered, and his expression carried none of the anger she had witnessed in the council chamber, only a quiet, careful concern that somehow felt harder to face than fury would have been. Sit, please, he said, gesturing toward a chair near the desk. This time, she did not argue, lowering herself into the seat, her eyes drawn immediately to the pendant resting between them. I had my personal historian examine this last night, Alden said, picking up the pendant carefully and turning it over in his hands. The crest belongs to House Varnell, a noble family that once held significant land and influence in the western provinces. Nearly 2 decades ago, they were accused of conspiracy against the crown, a charge that led to their exile and the seizure of their titles and lands. Illyra's breath caught, old fragments of memory suddenly aligning with facts she had never possessed before. "I do not know the details of what happened," she said quietly. "My mother never spoke of it directly. I only knew we had left somewhere, that we lived under different names, that certain questions were never to be asked." "Illyra," Alden said gently, setting the pendant down and moving to sit in the chair across from her, rather than remaining behind the desk, an act of consideration she noticed, even amid her rising anxiety. "Was your mother's name Adelina Varnell?" The name struck her like a physical blow, familiar in some deep, buried place within her memory, though she had not heard it spoken aloud in over a decade. "How do you know that name?" "My historian found records," he said carefully. "Adelina Varnell, daughter of Lord Varnell, vanished shortly after her family's exile, along with a young daughter believed to have been lost, or perhaps deliberately hidden away for safety. The crown at the time believed both had perished during the chaos of the exile. It seems that was not entirely accurate." Illyra felt the room spin slightly, the careful walls she had built around her identity crumbling entirely now, exposed before the one person whose opinion of her mattered more than she had ever intended to allow. "I was very young," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember almost nothing of that time. Only that my mother was afraid, always afraid, until the day she died and I was left entirely alone." "The conspiracy charges against your family," Alden said carefully, watching her closely. "Were they ever proven, do you know?" "I do not know anything for certain," Illyra admitted. "My mother never spoke of the details. I only know that she guarded our secret fiercely, that she believed our lives depended on no one discovering who we truly were." Alden was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful, turning the newfound information over carefully in his mind. "I looked into the original records last night," he said finally. "The conspiracy charges against House Varnell were based largely on testimony from a single source, a rival noble house that stood to benefit significantly from Varnell's downfall and the redistribution of their lands and titles." Illyra looked up sharply. "You believe the charges were false?" "I believe they deserve to be examined more closely than they were at the time," Alden said carefully. "Justice conducted in haste, particularly justice that conveniently benefits those delivering the accusations, is justice worth questioning." Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, stirred quietly in Illyra's chest, though old caution quickly rose to smother it. "Even if that were true, Your Majesty, what would it change? My family's name was destroyed decades ago. I have lived my entire life as no one, and I have made my peace with that existence." "Perhaps," Alden said, his gaze steady and searching, "but I do not think you should have to make peace with an injustice, simply because uncovering the truth proves inconvenient for those who benefited from the lie." Illyra studied him carefully, searching for some hidden motive behind his words, some political calculation she had not yet uncovered. She found none, only the same quiet honesty that had drawn her to trust him, despite every instinct urging caution. "There is something else," Alden said, his voice growing more careful, more measured. "The noble house that provided testimony against your family, the one that benefited from their exile and the seizure of their lands, was House Ashworth." Illyra frowned, the name unfamiliar to her. "I do not know that name." "Lady Priscilla's family," Alden said quietly, watching her expression carefully as the implication settled over her. The revelation struck her with sudden, cold clarity. Priscilla's hostility, her sharp warnings, her clear determination to see Illyra removed from the king's attention entirely, suddenly took on a far more dangerous dimension than simple jealousy over a potential mate. If the truth about House Varnell's innocence ever came fully to light, House Ashworth stood to lose everything they had gained through decades of stolen prestige and influence. "She knows," Illyra said slowly, understanding dawning with sickening clarity. "That is why she accused me of theft. She was searching for a reason to have my quarters investigated, hoping to find something, anything, that would confirm her suspicions about who I truly am." "It seems likely," Alden agreed grimly, "though I cannot yet prove her intentions with certainty." Illyra sat back in her chair, the weight of everything settling over her at once. Decades of careful hiding unraveling in a matter of days. exposing not only her own identity, but a conspiracy far larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined possible. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "That depends on many factors," Alden said honestly, "but I intend to pursue the truth of what happened to your family, regardless of how inconvenient that truth proves for those who benefited from the original injustice. You deserve to know your history, Alara, whatever that history ultimately reveals." "And if it reveals that my family truly was guilty of conspiracy?" she asked, voicing the fear she had carried silently for years. "Then we will face that truth honestly as well," Alden said. "But I do not believe that is what we will find, based on what little evidence I have already uncovered." They sat together in thoughtful silence for a long moment, the weight of newfound revelations settling comfortably between them despite the danger it clearly represented. Illyra found herself, despite every instinct urging continued caution, feeling a small measure of relief at finally sharing this burden with someone else, someone who had chosen to stand beside her rather than turn away from the complications her hidden past now threatened to create. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me, when you had every reason to doubt." "I have found very little reason to doubt you since the night we met," Alden said, a small, genuine smile softening his expression. "Whatever your family's true history, it does not change who you are now, the person I have come to know these past weeks." Illyra felt warmth rise in her chest, despite the danger surrounding them, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "Lady Priscilla will not simply allow this matter to rest," she said carefully. "If she suspects the truth, she will do everything within her power to ensure it never comes fully to light." "I am aware of that risk," Alden said, his expression growing serious once more. "Which is precisely why we must proceed carefully, and quickly, before she has the opportunity to act further against you." As if summoned by the very mention of her name, a sharp knock interrupted their conversation, and a guard entered, bowing quickly. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. Lady Priscilla requests an urgent audience. She claims to have discovered further evidence regarding the missing brooch." Alden's expression hardened, and he exchanged a brief, meaningful glance with Illyra before rising from his chair. "Send her in," he said, though his tone carried a clear warning of the confrontation soon to unfold, one that would determine far more than the fate of a simple missing piece of jewelry. Lady Priscilla entered the study with the same practiced grace she carried through every room, though Illyra noticed the faint tightness around her eyes, the small signs of tension beneath her carefully composed exterior. She curtsied to the king, her gaze flicking briefly toward Illyra with unmistakable coldness, before settling back on Alden with practiced warmth. "Your Majesty," she said smoothly, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I felt this matter required immediate attention. My personal attendant discovered something rather troubling this morning while cleaning my chambers." She produced a small folded piece of parchment and offered it toward the king, who took it with visible reluctance, his expression carefully neutral, despite the obvious tension in the room. He unfolded the parchment and scanned its contents, his jaw tightening as he read. "This appears to be a letter," he said slowly, "written in a hand, claiming to belong to Illyra, admitting to taking the brooch and describing intentions to use whatever influence she has gained with me to secure further advantages within the palace." Illyra's stomach dropped, cold horror spreading through her chest. "I wrote no such letter, Your Majesty. I swear it." Priscilla's expression remained perfectly composed, though something flickered briefly in her eyes, satisfaction quickly hidden behind a mask of concerned sympathy. "I understand this must be difficult to hear, but the evidence speaks clearly enough. My attendant found it tucked among linens, delivered from the kitchen staff, just this morning." "This is fabricated," Illyra said, her voice rising despite her attempt to remain composed. "I have never written a letter of any kind to Lady Priscilla, and I certainly did not take her brooch." "The handwriting will need to be examined," Alden said carefully, setting the parchment down on his desk with obvious distaste, "before any conclusions are drawn from this document. Forgeries are not difficult to produce for those with sufficient motivation and resources." Priscilla's composed expression flickered for just a moment, quickly smoothed over. "Your Majesty, I understand your fondness for this maid has clouded your judgment somewhat, but surely you must see the pattern forming here. A servant with hidden noble connections, suddenly the focus of the king's attention, now implicated in theft with a written confession in her own hand. How much evidence must accumulate before the truth becomes undeniable? Enough evidence that has not been conveniently discovered by your own household staff, Alden said, his voice carrying a sharp edge that made Priscilla's composure falter further. I find it remarkable, Lady Priscilla, that every piece of damaging evidence against Elira has originated from your immediate circle. The room fell silent, tension crackling between them, like the moment before a storm breaks. Priscilla's expression hardened, the pleasant mask finally cracking, to reveal something colder underneath. Are you accusing me of fabricating evidence, Your Majesty? I am observing a pattern that troubles me, Alden said carefully. One that I intend to investigate thoroughly, regardless of whose reputation it may ultimately implicate. Elira watched the exchange with mounting tension, understanding now that whatever calculated plan Priscilla had constructed was beginning to unravel under the king's careful scrutiny. Yet she also recognized the desperate danger in a cornered opponent, someone with everything to lose if the truth about House Varnell's innocence and House Ashworth's role in their downfall ever came fully to light. Your Majesty, Priscilla said, her voice regaining some of its careful smoothness, though an undercurrent of desperation had crept into her tone. I only wish to protect the integrity of this court from those who would exploit your kindness for personal gain. Surely you understand my concerns are motivated by loyalty to the crown, nothing more. Your concerns, Alden said evenly, seem remarkably specific and remarkably well-timed, given that I discovered evidence just yesterday connecting House Varnell's decades-old exile directly to testimony provided by House Ashworth. The color drained visibly from Priscilla's face, her carefully maintained composure shattering entirely for just a moment, before she forced it back into place. I do not understand what that ancient history has to do with anything currently before us, Your Majesty. Do you not? Alden asked quietly, his gaze unwavering. Because it seems to me that a family who benefited significantly from a false accusation against House Varnell might have considerable motivation to ensure the surviving heir of that family never gains enough influence or trust to question the legitimacy of that original conspiracy charge. Elira watched Priscilla's expression cycle rapidly through shock, calculation, and finally something closer to cold fury, the careful mask she had worn throughout their previous encounters finally stripped away entirely. You cannot possibly believe the ravings of a kitchen maid over the word of my family, Your Majesty. My father has served this crown loyally for decades. I have not yet drawn final conclusions, Alden said carefully, but I intend to examine the original records of House Varnell's exile personally, along with the testimony your family provided at the time. If those records prove the accusations against House Varnell were fabricated, the consequences for House Ashworth will be severe. Priscilla's hands clenched at her sides, her composure finally abandoning her entirely. This is absurd. You would risk generations of loyal service, an entire noble house's reputation, based on the unproven claims of a servant girl who happened to catch your eye at a single ball? I would risk far more than that to ensure justice is properly served, Alden said, his voice hardening with a resolve that left no room for argument. Whatever affection I hold for Elira, this matter extends far beyond personal feelings. If your family conspired to destroy an innocent house for political gain 2 decades ago, and now conspires to silence the surviving heir through fabricated evidence and forged letters, that is a crime against the crown itself, not merely a personal grievance. The silence that followed was thick with tension, Priscilla standing rigid and furious, her plans clearly unraveling faster than she had anticipated. Elira remained quiet, watching the confrontation with a strange mixture of fear and cautious hope, uncertain how this dangerous standoff would ultimately resolve. You will regret this decision, Your Majesty, Priscilla said finally, her voice low and cold, stripped entirely of its earlier pleasant warmth. My family will not simply accept baseless accusations without fighting to protect our name. Then we will let the evidence speak for itself, Alden said calmly, though the steel beneath his composed tone remained unmistakable. I suggest you consider carefully, Lady Priscilla, whether continuing down this path serves your family's interests better than honesty would at this point. Priscilla's gaze shifted briefly to Elira, cold and venomous, before she turned sharply and swept from the room without another word, her golden gown trailing behind her like a warning of trouble yet to come. Elira exhaled slowly once the door closed behind her, the tension in her shoulders only partially easing despite the king's clear support throughout the confrontation. "Your Majesty, I fear this has only made things more dangerous, not less. She will not simply accept defeat quietly." "I know," Alden said grimly, moving to sit behind his desk once more, his expression troubled despite his earlier resolve. "Which is why we must move quickly to gather solid evidence before she has the opportunity to cause further harm, either to your reputation or to your safety directly." Over the following days, the palace existed in a state of tense, uneasy anticipation, rumors swirling faster than ever through every corridor and chamber. Alden dispatched trusted advisors to retrieve the original records of House Varnell's exile from the royal archives, while quietly initiating an investigation into the handwriting on the forged confession letter, comparing it carefully against samples known to belong to members of Lady Priscilla's household. Elira, meanwhile, found herself caught in an uncomfortable limbo, no longer able to return fully to her previous invisible existence among the kitchen staff, yet not truly welcomed into the more formal circles of court life either. She spent her days assisting where she could, though Colin, worried for her safety, insisted she remain close to areas where guards loyal to the king could easily reach her if trouble arose. The evidence, when it finally came, arrived swiftly and decisively. The royal archivist confirmed that the original testimony against House Varnell had indeed come almost entirely from a single source within House Ashworth, corroborated by no independent witnesses, and containing several inconsistencies that should have raised suspicion at the time, but had been conveniently overlooked amid the political turmoil of the period. Separately, the handwriting analysis confirmed that the forged confession letter bore no genuine similarity to Elira's actual handwriting, but did match several samples known to belong to a scribe frequently employed by House Ashworth. Armed with this evidence, King Alden called for a formal council session, one that would determine not only Elira's fate, but the fate of House Ashworth's standing within the kingdom, and perhaps, at long last, some measure of justice for a family wrongfully destroyed 2 decades earlier. The council chamber was filled to capacity on the morning of the formal session, far more crowded than the smaller gathering that had accused Elira of theft only weeks before. Word had spread quickly through the palace that something significant was about to unfold, and nobles from every corner of the court had gathered to witness the outcome, their curiosity outweighing any pretense of discretion. Elira stood near the front of the chamber, dressed not in her usual gray servant's uniform, but in a simple, modest gown Alden had insisted she wear for the occasion, a small gesture of respect that had nonetheless drawn considerable attention from the assembled crowd. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, though she forced herself to stand tall, remembering the quiet strength her mother had shown, even in their most difficult years, hiding from a truth Elira now finally understood. Lord Edmund and the rest of the council sat at the long table, their expressions grave and attentive, as King Alden entered the chamber and took his place at the head of the room, the weight of his position settling visibly over his shoulders as he prepared to address the gathered court. 3 weeks ago, Alden began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, an accusation of theft was brought against a member of my household staff. That accusation led to the discovery of a pendant belonging to House Varnell, a noble family, exiled from this kingdom nearly 2 decades ago, on charges of conspiracy against the crown. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, though they quickly quieted as Alden continued. I have spent these past weeks investigating the circumstances surrounding both the original exile of House Varnell and the recent accusations brought against Elira, the young woman who has since been confirmed as the surviving daughter of that family. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. What I have discovered troubles me deeply. Lady Priscilla sat near the front of the assembled nobles, her expression carefully composed despite the visible tension in her posture. Her father, Lord Ashworth, seated stiffly beside her, his face pale and drawn. The original conspiracy charges against House Varnell, Alden continued, were based entirely on testimony provided by a single source, a member of House Ashworth, without independent corroboration. Records from that period, recently retrieved from the royal archives, reveal significant inconsistencies in that testimony, inconsistencies that were overlooked at the time amid the political urgency surrounding the case. He gestured, and a royal archivist stepped forward, presenting a stack of aged documents to the council table for examination. These records demonstrate clearly that the evidence against House Varnell was insufficient to justify the severity of the punishment imposed. Their exile, and the seizure of their lands and titles, appears to have been based on fabricated, or at minimum severely exaggerated claims. Lord Ashworth rose from his seat, his voice tight with barely restrained panic. "Your Majesty, my family's testimony was given in good faith, based on information available at the time. Surely you cannot hold us responsible for decisions made by the Crown decades ago." "I would agree with you," Alden said evenly, "if that were the full extent of the matter. However, recent events suggest a continuing pattern of deliberate deception, one far more difficult to dismiss as an honest mistake made long ago." He gestured again, and this time a royal scribe presented the forged confession letter alongside handwriting samples gathered from various members of House Ashworth's household staff. This letter, presented as a confession written by Alira admitting to theft, was analyzed by 3 independent scribes. All 3 concluded the handwriting does not match Alira's own, but bears strong similarity to samples provided by a scribe employed within Lady Priscilla's household. The chamber erupted into a storm of whispered exclamations, and Lady Priscilla rose from her seat, her composure finally cracking entirely under the mounting weight of evidence arrayed against her family. "This is absurd, Your Majesty. Any scribe's handwriting might show similarities to another's. This proves nothing definitively." "Perhaps not on its own," Alden agreed, "but combined with the inconsistencies in the original conspiracy testimony and the remarkably convenient timing of both the missing brooch accusation and this fabricated confession, a clear pattern emerges, one that suggests House Ashworth has consistently benefited from actions taken against House Varnell, both 20 years ago and again in recent weeks." Alira watched the confrontation unfold with a strange, distant calm, the fear that had gripped her for weeks giving way slowly to something steadier, something closer to quiet resolve. Whatever happened next, the truth was finally being spoken aloud, no longer buried beneath decades of silence and careful hiding. "Your Majesty," Lord Ashworth said, his voice now carrying genuine desperation rather than righteous indignation, "whatever mistakes may have occurred in the past, surely you would not destroy an entire noble house based on circumstantial evidence and the word of a servant girl." "I would not destroy anything based on insufficient evidence," Alden said firmly, "but I have gathered more than sufficient evidence to warrant a full formal investigation into House Ashworth's conduct, both regarding the original exile of House Varnell and the recent actions taken against Alira. Until that investigation concludes, House Ashworth's standing within this court will be suspended, and all titles and privileges held in trust, pending the outcome." The chamber fell into stunned silence at the severity of the king's decision, Lord Ashworth's face draining of all remaining color as the reality of the situation settled fully over him. Lady Priscilla remained standing, her expression cycling rapidly between fury and dawning horror as she recognized the collapse of everything her family had built over 2 decades of stolen prestige. "As for House Varnell," Alden continued, turning his attention toward Alira, who stood frozen near the front of the chamber, uncertain what words could possibly follow such a dramatic declaration. "The evidence strongly suggests their exile was unjust, built on fabricated testimony rather than genuine conspiracy against the crown. I intend to formally restore House Varnell's name and titles, pending final confirmation from the full investigation." A wave of astonished murmurs swept through the assembled nobility, and Alira felt the ground shift beneath her feet in an entirely different way than the fear and dread of previous weeks. Restoration, her mother's name, cleared after 20 years of exile and hiding, spoken aloud in this very chamber, before the full assembled court. "Alira Varnell," Alden said, his voice softening slightly as he addressed her directly, though it still carried clearly through the silent chamber. "As the sole surviving heir of House Varnell, you are hereby restored to your family's rightful title, and standing within this kingdom, effective immediately, pending the conclusion of the formal investigation." Alira felt tears rise unexpectedly to her eyes, decades of careful hiding, of loneliness and fear, finally beginning to loosen their grip on her chest. She managed a small, shaking bow toward the king, uncertain what proper etiquette required in a moment so entirely unprecedented in her own life. Lady Priscilla, watching the proceedings with growing desperation, made one final attempt to salvage the collapsing situation. "Your Majesty, even if House Varnell's exile proves to have been unjust, That does not erase the fact that this girl has spent years deceiving this court about her true identity. How can you trust someone who hid such significant truths from you? I did not hide it out of deception, Elira said quietly, finding her voice at last amid the chaos of the moment. I hid it out of fear, taught to me by a mother who watched her entire world destroyed by exactly the kind of political maneuvering your family has now attempted against me. I did not know the full truth of my own history until recently. I have never sought to deceive anyone, only to survive. Her words, quiet but clear, seemed to resonate through the chamber, several council members nodding slowly in understanding, their earlier suspicion visibly softening in the face of her evident sincerity. The council will deliberate further on the details of this matter, Lord Edmund said, rising from his seat, his earlier sternness now tempered with something closer to genuine respect as he regarded Elira. But I believe the evidence presented today speaks clearly enough for an initial judgment to be rendered. King Alden rose from his seat as well, moving to stand beside Elira, close enough that his presence offered a quiet, unmistakable show of support before the entire assembled court. This council session is concluded for today. House Ashworth's suspension takes immediate effect, pending full investigation. House Varnell's restoration will be formally documented within the week. As the chamber began to empty, nobles whispering excitedly among themselves at the dramatic reversal they had just witnessed, Lady Priscilla remained standing near her father, her expression a mixture of fury and disbelief at the sudden, complete collapse of every careful plan she had constructed. She caught Elira's gaze one final time as she was led from the chamber, and though no words passed between them, the message in her eyes remained clear enough: bitter acknowledgement of defeat, though not, perhaps, true acceptance of it. Elira watched her go, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease. Whatever justice had been served today, she doubted Priscilla would accept her family's fall from grace without further resistance. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not face that uncertainty alone. Alden turned to her once the chamber had mostly emptied, his expression warm despite the formal weight of everything that had just transpired. Your family's name has been restored, Elira. However this journey continues from here, you no longer need to carry that burden of hiding alone. Thank you, she said softly, the words feeling entirely insufficient for the magnitude of what he had done, not only for her personal safety, but for the truth of her mother's memory, finally honored after 20 long years of silence and shame that had never truly belonged to her family at all. There is still much to be settled, Alden said gently. The full investigation, the formal restoration of your titles and lands, and decisions yet to be made about what comes next for both of us. But I find myself hopeful, for the first time in longer than I can remember, about what that future might hold. Elira looked up at him, allowing herself, finally, to feel the full weight of hope she had spent weeks trying carefully to suppress. Whatever challenges remained ahead, she no longer faced them as an invisible maid hiding a dangerous secret, but as Elira Varnell, her mother's daughter, standing openly beside a king who had chosen to see her clearly from the very first night they met. The weeks that followed brought changes so swift and so significant that Elira sometimes found herself waking in the mornings, uncertain whether the previous day's events had truly happened or existed only within some vivid, impossible dream. The formal investigation into House Ashworth's conduct proceeded quickly under the king's direct oversight, uncovering further evidence that confirmed what the initial findings had already suggested: a deliberate pattern of deception spanning 2 decades, motivated by the significant lands and titles House Ashworth had gained at House Varnell's expense. Lord Ashworth, faced with overwhelming evidence and the collapse of his family's carefully maintained reputation, ultimately confessed to the full extent of the original conspiracy, revealing that his own father had orchestrated the false testimony against House Varnell out of long-standing rivalry and ambition for greater influence within the kingdom. The confession spared House Ashworth from the harshest possible punishment, though their titles and lands were significantly reduced, and their standing within the court diminished considerably as consequence for their actions. Lady Priscilla, stripped of the prestigious future she had once considered assured, departed the palace quietly, within days of her father's confession, retreating to whatever remained of her family's diminished estates in the western provinces. Elira did not know, and did not particularly wish to know, what became of her afterward, though she found she carried no lingering desire for further conflict, only quiet relief that the danger Priscilla had represented no longer loomed over her daily life. House Varnell's restoration proceeded with far greater ceremony. Illyra found herself, in the span of only a few short weeks, transformed from an invisible kitchen maid into Lady Illyra Varnell, heir to lands and a title she had never known existed for most of her life, formally welcomed into the highest circles of court society that had once looked past her without a second glance. The transition was not without its difficulties. Illyra struggled at times with the sudden shift in how others treated her. The same nobles who had once ignored her entirely, now bowing and offering elaborate courtesies, their sudden respect feeling, at times, uncomfortably hollow given how little had actually changed about who she was as a person. She found herself missing, unexpectedly, certain aspects of her quieter previous life. The simple camaraderie of the kitchen staff, the peaceful solitude of early mornings before the palace fully woke. Margaret and Colin remained constant presences throughout this transformation, their friendship offering a steady anchor amid the dizzying changes surrounding her. Margaret, in particular, took great delight in occasionally reminding Illyra of her days scrubbing pots and delivering trays, a gentle teasing that helped keep her grounded even as her circumstances shifted so dramatically around her. King Alden, for his part, remained a steady, comforting presence throughout the entire transition, continuing their quiet garden conversations whenever his duties allowed, though now conducted openly rather than in careful secrecy. Their relationship deepened gradually, built not on the sudden dramatic passion often celebrated in court romances, but on the same quiet honesty and mutual respect that had first drawn them together on that chaotic night at the ball. It was nearly 2 months after the formal restoration of House Varnell that Alden requested Illyra join him once more in the private garden, where so many of their earlier conversations had unfolded. She found him waiting near the fountain, the late afternoon light casting long golden shadows across the familiar stone path, and something in his expression, a careful nervousness she had rarely witnessed from him before, told her this meeting carried significance beyond their usual quiet conversations. "You seem troubled," she said, settling onto the familiar stone bench beside him. "Not troubled," he said, though a small, uncertain smile tugged at his lips. "Simply uncertain how best to say what I wish to say." Illyra waited patiently, watching him gather his thoughts, the same quiet patience she had learned through years of careful observation, now serving her well in this unexpected moment. "When we first met," Alden said finally, "I told you I wanted someone who saw me clearly, rather than the crown I carry. I did not expect, at the time, that such a simple wish would lead me here, to this moment, with you." He turned to face her fully, taking her hands gently in his own. "Illyra Varnell, these past months have shown me something I had begun to believe impossible to find. Genuine partnership built on honesty, rather than obligation or political convenience. I would like to ask you to consider becoming my wife and queen of this kingdom, not because our union would satisfy the expectations of my advisors or the political needs of the court, but because I cannot imagine facing the responsibilities of this crown without you standing beside me." Illyra felt tears rise unexpectedly to her eyes, the culmination of everything that had unfolded since that chaotic night of spilled wine and broken glass, settling over her in a wave of overwhelming emotion. She thought of her mother, of the careful, frightened years spent hiding a truth she had never fully understood, of the quiet, invisible existence she had built for herself, out of necessity, rather than choice. And she thought of everything that had changed since, the honest conversations in this very garden, the steady support through danger and revelation, the genuine partnership Alden now offered her freely, without condition or expectation. "Yes," she said softly, then again, more firmly, as the full weight of her answer settled fully within her heart. "Yes, I will marry you." The relief and joy that broke across Alden's expression at her answer was unlike anything she had witnessed from him before, the careful composure he maintained before the court entirely absent, replaced by simple, unguarded happiness. He drew her gently into an embrace, and for a long moment, they remained there together in the quiet garden, the weight of crowns and titles and political obligations fading into the background against the simple, profound joy of the moment. News of their engagement spread through the palace and beyond within days, met with a complicated mixture of reactions among the nobility. Many celebrated the romantic nature of the king's choice, a story that seemed almost impossibly fitting, given the dramatic circumstances surrounding Alira's restoration to House Farnell. Others, more cynical, whispered quietly about political convenience, though such whispers found little traction, given the clear evidence of genuine affection that had grown between the king and his chosen bride over many months of careful, honest courtship. The wedding itself was held in early autumn, in the very ballroom where Alira had once served as an invisible maid, now transformed with elaborate decorations of gold and deep blue, the colors of House Farnell restored alongside the traditional royal colors, in a symbolic gesture that spoke clearly of the union being celebrated. Alira stood before the assembled court, dressed not in the plain gray uniform of her former life, but in an elegant gown that honored both her restored noble heritage and the personal journey that had brought her to this moment. As she walked down the aisle toward Alden, waiting patiently at the altar with unmistakable joy shining in his eyes, she caught sight of familiar faces among the crowd, Margaret dabbing happily at tears, Colin beaming with obvious pride, even Lord Edmund offering a small, respectful nod of approval as she passed. The invisible maid who had once moved unnoticed through this very hall, now stood at its very center, celebrated rather than overlooked, chosen rather than dismissed. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of joy and quiet emotion, vows exchanged with genuine sincerity, rather than empty formal tradition, a public declaration of the honest partnership they had built together through months of careful, patient trust. When Alden finally placed the crown upon her head, formally declaring her queen of the realm, Alira felt none of the fear that had once defined so much of her early life within these palace walls, only a quiet, steady confidence in the future now stretching before her. In the years that followed, Queen Alira became known throughout the kingdom, not merely for the dramatic circumstances of her rise from invisible maid to crowned queen, but for the genuine wisdom and compassion she brought to her role, remembering always the years spent unseen and unheard, ensuring that the voices of servants and common folk throughout the kingdom received fair consideration within the halls of power that had once looked past her entirely. She never forgot the lessons of her earlier life, the quiet strength required to survive years of hiding, the careful patience needed to navigate a world that had taught her invisibility was safer than being seen. But she also never forgot the courage it had taken to finally step forward when the moment demanded it, to trust in honesty even when deception might have felt safer, and to accept love freely offered, rather than retreating into the familiar shadows of her former life. King Alden and Queen Alira ruled together with a partnership built on the same foundation that had first drawn them together in that chaotic, unexpected moment beside a shattered wineglass: honesty, mutual respect, and the quiet recognition that true worth had never depended on titles, crowns, or noble birth, but on the character carried within each person, seen clearly by those willing to truly look. And though the kingdom would remember many stories of kings and queens throughout its long history, none would be told quite so often, nor quite so fondly, as the story of the silent maid every alpha at the ball had ignored, except for the one who ruled the kingdom, and who had seen her clearly from that very first night, when no one else had bothered to look at all.